Hi guys, welcome to this hands-on lesson. In this lesson we're going to create a custom VPC and we're going to create some subnets within that VPC. Now let's have a quick look at the topology we're going to create. So the first thing we have to do in the AWS Management Console is select the region that we want to create the VPC in because it's a regional service. We then create a VPC and we need to specify the CIDR block for that VPC. And then we're going to deploy some subnets, and those subnets each get attached to an availability zone. Now there might be more than 3 availability zones in the region we choose. Sometimes there are up to 6. There can even be more. However, for this we only need 3. So I'm happy with 3 public subnets and 3 private subnets. And that should be enough for any architectures that we're going to deploy onto this test environment. So I create my 3 public subnets, and each of those will need an IP address block from the CIDR address block of the VPC, and will then need 3 private subnets, and each of those will also need its own IP address range. So that's what we're going to do. Let's head over now and start setting this up. At the end of the last lesson, we used this IPv4 subnet creator from network00.com to work out the address block and the subnets that are going to be within that address block. So we chose 10.0.0.0 with a /16 subnet mask, and that's going to give us more than 4,000 hosts per subnet, which is a large number, but you never know what you're going to deploy into your subnet. So you've always got to work this out up front when you determine the size of the subnet ranges that you want to use. And also remember, when you're specifying your overall CIDR block, that you need to work out how many VPCs you're going to need. So you might deploy VPCs across a lot of different regions, and you might have multiple VPCs in each region. And you need to consider whether those ranges need to be unique. So they have to be unique within a region, but I could use this same address block in multiple regions. The problem is it might lead to issues down the line when I want to use features such as VPC peering, which we're going to look at later in this course, which requires unique address blocks. So we're happy with our overall CIDR block, and these are our subnets. And we're going to use 6 of these for the 6 subnets that we create in our new VPC. So let's go over to the AWS Management Console and start building this out. I'm in the AWS Management Console and I'm choosing North Virginia. And I suggest you do too. You can choose a region that's closest to you. Sometimes we find that there are certain features which are released in North Virginia before other places. It's where new features tend to be released first. So sometimes there can be differences, and you might find that certain things don't work in other regions. But most of the stuff that we're going to cover in this course will be available in most regions, so you should be okay if you want to choose one closer to you. I'm using North Virginia, and let's go to VPC. In the VPC Management Console, you'll see there's a VPC wizard here. If you choose the wizard, it gives you a few different options for creating certain topologies. So you can have a VPC with a single subnet, VPC with public and private subnets. You can have a VPC with public and private subnets and hardware VPN access, or a VPC with a private subnet only and a hardware VPN access. So there's a few different options. Now we're not going to do that, we're going to do it manually, but that will automatically create the VPC for you if you're happy with those specific configurations. What we're going to do is choose your VPCs. We can see we have the default VPC here, but we're going to create our own. So let's choose Create VPC, and then I'm going to specify my CIDR address block. So that's going to be 10.0.0.0/16. And for now, we're going to leave the no IPv6 CIDR block. We could use an Amazon provided IPv6 CIDR block or one that we have ourselves, but we're not going to do that now. We will do that later on in the section. You can add that later on, so that's the key point here. Now tenancy, what this means is you can change from default to dedicated. If you do that, when you launch EC2 instances into your VPC, they'll be on dedicated hardware. That's going to cost you a lot more money. For some organizations, that might be a requirement for some workloads. So we're going to leave that as default and choose Create VPC. So we now have a VPC. We've got a VPC ID. We can see the tenancy is default, and this is not a default VPC. We get a DHCP option set, which I'll cover later on. We can see our CIDR block, DNS host names disabled, and then we've got a route table. So it does always have, every VPC has a main route table. And we're going to edit that one and create our own shortly as well, in the next lesson actually. DNS resolution is enabled, and it has a network ACL which is assigned, and we'll look into that in a bit more detail later on. That's essentially a subnet level firewall. So we've got our VPC, but we can't do much with it until we've actually got some subnets. So let's go and create our subnets. So we can see that we have 6 subnets that exist already, and these are in the default VPC. And if you look across a little bit further here, you'll see that in the availability zones, they're attached to different availability zones. There are 6 availability zones in this region. They're US East 1A through to 1F. What we're going to do is we're going to create 3 public subnets and 3 private subnets, and I'm going to split those across A, B, and C. So you could split them, maybe the public subnets over A, B, C, and the private subnets over D, E, F if you wanted to, for a little extra redundancy. But for the intents of this particular course, I'm happy with splitting them across these 3 availability zones. So let's choose Create Subnet. We now have to specify the VPC, so make sure you choose the one with the custom CIDR block. For the subnet name, what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose the availability zone, and then I'm going to call it either public or private. So this is going to be a public subnet, and then -1A. So that is very indicative to me. When I'm deploying my resources, I know that this is a public subnet, and I know the availability zone that it's attached to. So if I wanted to distribute my resources across different availability zones for high availability, it's a bit easier for me to see where these particular subnets are assigned. Now we'll go back over here, and I'm going to copy the CIDR block for my first subnet. Come back, paste that in, and then I'm not going to add anything else, just create the subnet. So that's our public subnet. Now the only other thing I need to do for a public subnet is I need to come here and modify the auto assign IP settings. And I'm going to select this option here, enable auto assign public IPv4 address. And that means that every EC2 instance that we launch into the subnet will get a public IP address. Let's click on save. Now the other thing that we need to do, which we'll do in the next lesson, is create an internet gateway, attach it to the VPC, and specify it in the route table. And then this will definitely be a public subnet that does work properly. So then we just need to go in and do exactly the same thing for all the other subnets. So again, I come in, I'm going to call this one public-1B, specify 1B as the availability zone, come back to my web page here, copy my next subnet block, paste that in, and then click on Create Subnet. Now, I'm not going to show you every single one of these. It's the same process for all 6. So just create 3 public and 3 private. And just remember, for the public subnets, you need to modify the auto assign IP settings. Click on save. You don't need to do that for the private subnets. I finished creating all my subnets now. So I've now got private 1A, 1B, and 1C, and public 1A, 1B, and 1C. And the 3 on the bottom here, the public subnets should, if we scroll across a little way, we should find that they have the auto assign public IPv4 address set to yes. So just make sure that that's definitely the case. And we can see that they're all associated with the same route table. So that's the default setting. In the next lesson, we're going to attach an internet gateway to the VPC, and then we're going to create a separate route table for the private subnet. And that will be useful for later in the course when we add a NAT gateway. So hope that was useful. I'll see you in the next lesson.